Good everybody. Thank you for braving the fog and the cold and all the snow and ice on the roads. We're glad you're here, and we are excited about the concert tomorrow night and excited to tell you a little bit more about it. My name is William Intriligator. I'm the music director and conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. And sitting beside me we have Sarah Hartmann, who is very appropriate in this building because there's a very strong connection. In fact, this is, as you can see here, the Carrie D. Hartmann performance stage, which is named for her mother, who is the director. So we welcome Sarah Hartmann, and we welcome Sean Ambrose, who's a huge part of our musical community here in Cheyenne and has been an educator, a musician in Cheyenne for more than anybody wants to reveal. So please join me in welcoming Sarah and Sean. The program tomorrow night is not a typical concert. In fact, it will be more of a dramatic presentation than a true concert per se. The impetus and inspiration behind it was entirely Sarah's. And maybe Sarah, you can give us a little bit of background about what inspired this.
Yes, so it came out of a couple of different things. So I don't know if you recall, I don't remember where we were, but we were talking a little bit about your family, and you have the physics background, and so this sort of shared love and interest in science and art. So we were talking about that, and then we were talking about the upcoming eclipse that's happening in April. That sadly is not passing over Wyoming, but it will pass through the U.S. Once again. And between those two things, the wheel just started turning about creating a piece around this concept called the music of the spheres, which we unpack this a little bit during the concert itself, but essentially it's Pythagoras, who you may know from his theorem. He had this idea that at the center of the universe was the Earth. This was the widely held belief at the time, and that sitting around the Earth, the sun, the moon, each of the planets, and then the stars sat on concentric crystalline spheres. And that these spheres moved, which was where the orbits came from. And his belief that he sort of came to through a discovery of vibration and sound was that the movement of these spheres created music. It created this music of the spheres. There were all sorts of different beliefs at the time. Some philosophers thought that the reason we're not hearing it is because we hear it from the moment that we're born, so it's always in our ears, so we're not aware that it's there. Some thought that when we die, it rushes all into our ears all at once, so we hear the music of the heavens at the moment of our death. And other people thought it wasn't real, all sorts of these different beliefs. But to me, one of the things that I just found so stunning about this concept was it was this time in history when to think about science, so to think about astronomy, was to think about art, was to think about the divine, that each of these things weren't separate from each other, which I think can happen a lot now that you've got your STEM and your humanities, and there the two shall touch. But to me, I never see the divine more than in music and in the heavens, and so I think that this concert is really an opportunity to unite those things together once again and find other points of connection, I think, throughout. So that's what the idea came from.
Beautifully staged. And I was intrigued by the idea as well because I was familiar already with a number of pieces of music, of classical music, called Music of the Spheres. There's a Johann Strauss piece, there's pieces
A Coldplay CD.
A Coldplay CD. That one I wasn't familiar with, but I became familiar with it. But there are a number of other pieces. A lot of other composers sort of took that concept and created pieces of music around it. And so we thought, well, there might be a whole evening of a presentation here. Because, as many of you will remember, Sarah was responsible for the Star-Crossed Lovers Romeo and Juliet production that we did many years ago, which was so fantastic and that had pairs of actors, dancers, and opera singers as Romeos and Juliets, and retold the story with them and the orchestra in a brilliant way. So we were trying to find another dramatic presentation to do and to pick Sarah's brain and her brilliant genius ideas. So this is the first time tomorrow night this Music of the Spheres presentation will ever have been done. So it's we're making it up. but tell us a little bit more about some of the background and some of the research that you did in developing some of these ideas, and then we'll get into some of the specific pieces of music and Sean's involvement.
So it was a lot of fun starting that. I think William and I had like a shared document going. We were name every piece of music you can think of that has something to do with space or with the planet. So we knew from the get-go that, okay, Holst, the planets would be the spine of the evening. So sort of went in knowing that that's the core. And then from there, we talked a lot about other pieces that are actually showing up elsewhere in the season.
Yes.
So there's a Helios overture, so okay, is there something about the sun? Do we want a piece about the moon? So sort of thinking, what is the journey that we want to take our audience through? So I think that that's one of the things that also coming at this type of storytelling as someone who has theater as the core of the work that I do is that there's narrative is core to everything that I do, that type of narrative storytelling is the basis for everything. And so within that, thinking, well, what is the narrative journey that we want to take our audience through? And so once we sort of narrow down our pieces, that we start with, you'll see in the program it'll be sort of laid out so you can also read along with the journey, that it starts with this fabulous piece called Mothership that I think as a launch into space. So you get the feeling of being launched into the cosmos right off the bat. And then from there, we go through, there's a section about Earth, which we'll sort of talk about Pythagoras and things like that. And then we go through the planets, which when we talk about the Holst, we can talk about how they're not necessarily in the order that we think of when we think of the order of the planets from the sun out. And then from there, we get into constellations, and then moonrise is where we end. And so it was a lot of fun sort of thinking, well, what's the journey we want to go on and what pieces of music best suit that? And then within that, for the writing that's in between, what is the text or the story that helps get the audience on the emotional journey from one piece of music into the next? And so that was a lot of fun and a challenge, and now and again, to figure out what's the best bridge between a couple of these pieces. But
it includes some beautiful texts too. A lot of it is your own original script, but then you tell us a little bit about the poem and the excerpt from the play.
Yeah, so for the text that I also, I am so interested in the intersection between different art forms and different writing and how those things come together to elevate whatever theme or story you're trying to tell. And so, yes, within this there's various pieces of text that I've written, sort of anecdotes from my life and dramatized versions of maybe questions that have come out of my own experiences looking at space and the stars. But then there's so many writers who have also had these same questions about looking up at space and thinking about what is the meaning of me? What is the meaning of music? How do these things come together? And so there's some text in the piece as well. There's some Shakespeare, there's some T.S. Eliot, there's a couple quotes from various philosophers, from Carl Sagan, one of his famous quotes is in the piece. So that felt important to me to also connect all of the many different types of minds and thinkers who have this shared task of looking up and wondering.
Right, yeah. So there's a bit of history, there's a bit of literature, there's music, and all of these things, and this whole science behind some of these things are all intertwined. It's very exciting. We could talk a little bit about Mothership, or we could talk about Sean's involvement, because for most of the production, Sarah will be the main sort of dramatic part of the piece on stage, other than the orchestra. But then at one point, a whole chorus of women comes and joins her on stage. Sean, tell us a little bit about this.
So, for those of you that may be familiar with the Holst planets, the final movement, of course, has women's chorus as one of the instruments of the orchestra. It's not chorus as we typically think of it. They're not standing on stage being the focal point of the lyric or whatever. They are yet another instrument in the orchestra. Kind of along with the celeste, the organ, some of those things that we're not used to, the bass oboe, as it were. So, in the collaboration that we've got here, putting the women's chorus together this time also involved a collaboration here in town, which is, that's kind of where I live. Community arts, performing arts, of course, music education. But in this case, we've brought together women from, of course, Cheyenne Chamber Singers, who were so blessed to be able to do this, to be the first call every time, and I am beyond thankful for that. But in addition, we've got ladies singing that are members of Capitol Chorale, that of course are my amazing collaborative pianist Wade Hozoffel is conducting now. We've got ladies from LCCC, Cantorai, and the chamber chorus out there, that Beth Jacobs, who is one of our soloists, is the teacher out there. And we have some of the ladies from China Lowell Theater. So we've brought together 4 performing arts organizations in town as part of the collaboration with the symphony this time, which is really cool to me. So we've got that piece as the instrument, as the vocal instrument in the orchestra. And then, do we want to launch into the Floyd, or shall we save that particular bit?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to share, because we're talking about the narrative and the
Right.
drama, and
So-
this is an important part of it is that they join Sarah.
Right, so musically, what we've done, a little bit of sacrilege, we've split the planets in half, you know. It is what it is, that's William's fault, not mine. But following that journey through the planets, then this amazing soprano aria from Floyd's opera Susanna, which is written for a soprano solo. So speaking of sacrilege
Yes.
or incredible vision, let's go with incredible vision. We're taking a soprano aria and we're having all 47 women sing it.
And it's not an easy aria.
It's not an easy aria. But what we've actually done, and this truly is because of the vision of these two next to me, is to take parts of, and we're not doing the entire aria, but we're doing those parts that are related to the night sky and looking up. The title of the aria is In It a Pretty Night, which this was originally written for Leontine Price. So that gives you a little bit of the era and the voice that this was originally done for. So what we've done, we have 3 soloists that are going to take small parts of it, and then we have 2 small groups of ladies that are going to do sort of the response to the statement of Ain't It a Pretty Night. And then we have the full chorus, which we'll leave a little bit of, not telling them everything, but we'll have the full chorus as part of this to do some of the village response, I guess is how I'm going to interpret that. So we've taken this, a portion of this beautiful soprano aria and allowed, and I'm excited to see how this comes to fruition tonight. We're putting the women with the orchestra tonight for the first time. To see how the vision of a soprano aria from a Floyd opera works in this particular scenario. I'm very excited. I've been a little nervous about this, but it's going to be awesome. I'm really excited. But you need to see it. I'm not going to tell you any more about the end, though.
Well, I'm tremendously grateful to Sean for his incredibly careful and meticulous preparation and for this. Not only just preparing a 6-part offstage wordless women's course for the Holst,
Double course.
Double course, yes. And then transforming them into this, filling out this Ain't It a Pretty Night aria too. So you've had a huge responsibility, and you've been so wonderful.
It's been fun.
You've been a great partner. Yeah. So just talking about the music, we can go to the top and talk a little bit about Mason Bates and Mothership, because that's a composer our friends here may be unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
Mason Bates is a young American composer. I guess he's probably close to my age. I shouldn't say young anymore.
Advancing.
Yes, advancing, like we all are. He's based in the Bay Area. I think this will be his first piece that the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra will have played. And he writes music that oftentimes incorporates elements of electronic music or electronic dance music into the orchestra. He actually moonlights as an electronic dance music DJ under the moniker Masonic. His name is, again, Mason Bates. But this piece, Mothership, also had an interesting origin because it was commissioned by Michael Tilson Thomas, a very famous conductor and composer, for the first performance of the so-called U2 Symphony Orchestra. An orchestra that was an assemblage of musicians from all over the world who submitted their individual audition videos over YouTube, and were judged by people and then came together to form a symphony orchestra that performed at the Sydney Opera House in 2011. And this was the opening piece of the concert of that group. And so it does really, it's fascinating. It does incorporate a laptop computer in the orchestra that has pre-recorded spaceship sounds, let's just say, and beats that really don't have anything to do with the spaceship, but that bring the feel of electronic dance music into the orchestra, balancing the acoustic instruments of the orchestra, and this electronic element from the laptop is one of the challenges of this piece. But it's also interesting because those pre-recorded sounds on the laptop are set in motion and they have a particular tempo. In some ways, my job as a conductor is kind of put on the back burner because that is ending up sort of leading the orchestra in a sense. So, you know, one element of my job as a conductor is sort of relieved in a sense. I'm more about cues than because we can all hear this pulse going on in the laptop.
Do you want to hear that,
I'll give you an
William?
example of what this piece sounds like.
I have it.
So there are instruments in the orchestra playing along here, but you can probably tell which are the recorded sounds and which are actual instruments.
I have the laptop part.
It's very exciting, lots of energy. And the composer wrote this beautiful program note that he says, the orchestra is the mothership, floating above the earth with the heart of techno. That's what he said. He also described it as a scherzo with a double trio. So if you have a musical background, you might recognize that oftentimes there's a movement like a scherzo or a minuet that has a middle section called a trio, where maybe a smaller group plays, or sometimes individual or groups of musicians are featured in a different way. And so this has a sort of double trio. So we have the opening music, and then it goes into something that he calls in the score the docking episode. So he was on the New York City subway, and he saw as it stopped in each subway station, people would come on and off, and he was imagining it sort of like a spaceship with, you know, people docking in and out. And so he had this idea that there could be soloists within the orchestra who they sort of dock with the mothership, and they are featured in some solos. So each docking episode features a solo instrument. The first one is an E-flat clarinet, that's the little piccolo clarinet, and then a marimba. And then the original music from the beginning comes back, and then it goes back into the second docking episode, which features solo cello and solo trumpet. And so each of those cases of the marimba or the E-flat clarinet, the cello and the trumpet, they're given parts in the score, but they're also encouraged to improvise. And so these players will come out, well, they won't literally come out of the orchestra, but they'll be featured and they'll be improvising a part. So there's some kind of, you know, originality, which is a wonderful way to tie into, you know, the way classical music used to always be presented, was that improvisation, embellishments, originality was you know, a hallmark of almost every performance going into like maybe the 1800s, and then it sort of became more codified and, you know, respected and revered, and we dare not touch it, that type of thing. But very much like, you know, in jazz, you know, this has come back around, obviously, and it's wonderful that he's including that element to this piece. And then the original music comes back, and it has a wonderful little coda. So as that opening music comes back twice after each docking episode, you'll feel like, oh yeah, we're back to something I'm familiar with, and we're sort of recognize this piece. It ends up feeling very familiar. Lindsay, our executive director, was pointing out that the actual laptop that we're using in the orchestra is right in front of her. And she has the samples right there. So I don't know, do you want, she was offering to play some of them. I don't know, do you have, I can hold the mic up to it if you want. Mothership Sampler.
Let's see. It should go.
Maybe with all these cords,
Oh,
there's
it's
something
maybe
not
not,
coming through the
yeah.
speakers. Yeah, oh, or is this on, that muted?
It's all the way up.
Oh, it's all the way up. Okay, well, we'll
Well,
skip.
sorry.
If she gets it to work, you just interject. You know, I was wondering, I was talking to Sarah, don't you want to introduce Mothership or start the, like, dramatic evening before it to sort of set the stage? And she's like, no, the music really speaks for itself in
I
that
think
piece.
it really does. Yeah.
It really, especially the blast off, you know?
But it's a great orchestra showpiece. It doesn't, having the electronic sampled sounds does not necessarily make the orchestra's part less important or easier. So it is quite a wonderful little virtuoso piece for the orchestra as well, and a great concert opener. Very excited, and maybe we'll have to look into more of his music for future concerts.
Sorry.
And yeah, did you ever get that, Lindsay?
No,
Well,
I think
good
it's
to
set
see
up
it. I think
to
her a
go
little
through the
bit.
sound system.
Yeah, totally. Well, and then you're gonna explain a little bit more about some of the properties of music, the scientific properties of music. I don't know if you want to save that for tomorrow night or mention anything about that now.
We can talk a little bit about that now. So it's, I don't know if any of you have seen or remember Donald Duck in Magic Land. Anybody remember this? From I was raised on Donald Duck in Magic Land. So this is really where the first inspiration for this bit of the show came from. So the cartoon of this is this delightful cartoon of Donald Duck learning about math. And so there's a section where he plays pool to learn about geometry and all these things. But one of the sections is where he learns about the relationship between mathematical ratios and how that explains harmonics. And there's, I won't tell you all the stories about it, like sort of the apocryphal story about how he came to discover this. We include that a little bit in the show. But I was always found that so fascinating as a child, and I think that there's something so interesting about us including that a little bit in the concert, partly because it's another bridge into this idea of movement creating sound waves, movement in certain ratios, so math creating harmony, where harmonics come from, and then movement and relationships between things having other meaning as we go along, becoming music, becoming other types of meaning that I hope the audience will sort of put together for themselves over the course of the evening. But I wonder, I'd be curious about your perspective on that part of the concerts.
I think it's great, and I think even some of the musicians in the orchestra will find it very educational and inspiring too. And you're making the connection between, like everyday objects and this beautiful, mysterious thing we know as music, and the scientific properties behind those sound waves, and how music is created. I think it's a great refresher course for people who do it, and people who did know it, it might blow their minds. So I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
And I think that there's something about starting the concert off with that piece as well that one of the things that I'm hoping that audiences take away over the course of this concert is thinking about the connections between things, between concepts, between fields of study, between each other, between. And this idea of just the facts of sound waves and the facts of math, that those are just data points. It's when we put them together in certain ways that we're the ones who make meaning out of those points of fact or of data. And so I think that there's something really exciting about starting off our concert that way as well. But here's sort of the building blocks that we then, as humans, use to make meaning out of the world as we experience it.
Right. It's so cool.
Yeah.
And then we'll go into the planets. Yes. And many of you are familiar with this incredible piece for large orchestra.
You should tell them how many orchestra members we'll have on stage.
I believe it's 95 players on stage, plus 48 women board members. Yes. So,
Cast of thousands?
yeah, it does require a large orchestra. And it's amazing the way he uses the orchestra for so many different sound colors and moods and emotions. as Sean already mentioned, there are unusual instruments. So it's not just the number of instruments, but the ones he chose. Things like the bass oboe or the alto flute, the unusual double set of timpani drums, where because of that they can actually create melodies with the timpani at times. And have many more notes available to them because a set of timpani normally has 4 drums, sometimes 5. But in this case, we'll have 7 drums. So you almost can have a scale there if you need it. So, and Holst takes advantage of that at times. Things like the celeste, which when this was written in 1914, 1915, was still pretty rare. Has a big part. The organ has a big part. Sometimes even just the pedal of the organ comes in by itself and has a big part. So 2 harps create an incredible effect. The sound of 2 harps playing together can create this otherworldly and heavenly kind of sound. So there are a number of unusual instruments in the orchestra. There's a small tuba, a tenor tuba, more like a euphonium or baritone type of instrument, and that is featured in prominent solos. Instead of the normal 4 French horns, there are 6, and he arranges them in interesting groupings of like 3 and 3, so that he can create a chord of 3 notes with the first 3 and a chord of 3 notes with the other 3. And that's something that he does very intriguingly throughout this score, is that sometimes he puts different chords together at the same time. And in Mars, for instance, that's something that he does to create a sense of tension and a sense of conflict. The Mars is the bringer of war, and that's how the piece opens. The whole suite begins with Mars. Some people think that maybe he was writing this in the early 19-teens or whatever as a response to what was about to happen with World War I or what had already happened. When he began writing Mars, war had not broken out yet. World War I had not started, but it was certainly, there was tension in the air. And by the time he actually completed the suite, World War I had already kind of come and gone, I think. So it took him a number of years. It's also interesting to know that Gustav Holst was in his 40s when he wrote this piece, and it was kind of like his first big orchestral piece, and the only one he kind of wrote like this. He was still an obscure, unknown composer when he wrote this piece. He was teaching at the St. Paul School for Girls, teaching music, and composing on the weekends and during his August holidays, vacation time, and squeezing in, writing some choral pieces, writing some small chamber music, writing pieces for strings for his students at the girls' school. But he had not written anything on the world stage for the world to hear, really. And then he wrote this piece, and it was, sensational. It was given a private performance first, and then a few years later, a public performance. By the time the public performance happened, it was 1920. And it was so well received, this shy, introverted composer who didn't want the attention was suddenly world famous. Orchestras in different countries were vying for the premiere in their countries. In the US, the Chicago Symphony and the New York Philharmonic duked it out, and the only way they settled it was to perform it on the same day so that they could both have the American premiere. So it was premiered on the same day in both cities. So crazy. So so it was so well received. But an interesting thing is that he didn't want to take advantage of that newfound fame and bang on that and create a follow-up piece or a number of other pieces. He was like, that's it for me, because he wanted to be able to write with complete artistic freedom. Like when you hear the planets, one of the things that's so special about it is that it's quirky and idiosyncratic, not just in the themes that he chose, these astrological signs more than astronomical planets, but also the orchestration, these creative rule breakings of harmony that I already kind of referred to. So he didn't want the public to have a say in what he would write next. So he liked being able to write in a vacuum just for himself, and that's what he went on to continue to do. He was also had a lifelong fascination with Sanskrit literature and learned to read and write in Sanskrit, translate original documents. It was in 1912 on a vacation in Spain that he and some friends really geeked out about astrology, and that became kind of a lifelong interest of his. So he would read horoscopes and learn more about astrology, and really this orchestral showpiece, this incredible sensational piece, came out of that love of astrology, not astronomy so much. And that also explains the ordering of the movements, perhaps. Yeah. So anything you want to jump in and share about any of that?
I'd like to pick up on this idea. You'll notice that each of the movements also has a subtitle. So Mars, the bringer of war. We'll have other Saturn, the bringer of old age. Uranus is the magician, which that's one of my particular favorites of all of them. And sort of we find ways to have the text lead into the different characters of each of these pieces. And the thing that I think was interesting about that from a programming point of view and also just from the narrative point of view is that it's exactly what we're talking about, that he was interested in the astrological meanings, such as he interpreted it, of these planets. And there are various texts that I think he used, that he drew from in particular to think through, well, what does Mars mean in astrology and how does he bring that idea to life? And so I think there's something interesting about the journey through these pieces, that whatever your personal beliefs are on astrology, that I do think is interesting that we all have some sort of feeling and meaning that we put into space, whether it's just the feeling of awe, whether it's a belief that Saturn means something in particular for us. And so I think there's just an interesting path through this that is beyond the astronomy of it and is into whatever sort of other meaning we might have on a space.
Absolutely. And, you know, even astrological skeptics might say something like, well, you could say that about a lot of things,
Yeah.
you know? But, you know, perhaps Holst recognized that there are certain universal qualities. So, like, the warlike tendencies, peace-like tendencies, the joy of the Jupiter movement, the old age and dreaming of heaven of Saturn, the trickster quality of the magician, and that sort of mystical quality of Neptune, and not to overlook Mercury and that sort of fun, fleeting kind of thing. It's almost like stages of life and moods that everybody has and you know, can experience and can relate to are put here in music. And so you don't even have to believe in astrology and science to recognize that's old age, or that's youth, or that's peace and beauty and love, or that's war.
Yeah.
And these things that are part of life. Yeah. So, yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about the beginning of Mars. It's pretty special the way it starts. There's some tapping that the string section does. They use the wood of their bow to tap their strings to create a percussion sound. So the very first thing they play is percussion, basically. And them, along with the timpani drum, create this rhythm. It's repeated over and over and over again. What we call an ostinato in music, which is, you know, it's the Italian word for basically obstinate. It is unrelenting. It's obstinate. There's only a few moments in this first movement where that ostinato is not present. And so it starts quietly and it builds. And the meter is important too, because it's not in a very conventional meter. You would think that perhaps there's a march going on with going to war. Well, it's a very off-kilter march, perhaps. This will keep building and building, but underneath all that is a nothing really had quite been written quite like that up to that time. Not just that kind of ostinato that mixed with the meter. It's fascinating. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes Holst will combine different key harmonic areas to create tension. So in this movement, there's very much of an underpinning of G or C against D flat major. So it's, you almost have like C major and D flat major, which are right up against each other on the keyboard, right? They're against each other, creating this sense of conflict. In fact, by the end of the movement, it's so intense that you hear this like intense chord that is played by the brass and others, and you kind of sense that there's this harsh dissonance in there, and that's because what you're hearing is that clash. And then finally, it's like C major wins out at the end. I'll just play you a little bit of that. This is going to be loud. I'm just going to turn my volume down, make sure it doesn't blow us away here. It's coming. But you can sense that clashed chord that you hear. Those are those two key areas sort of put together. Inspired a lot of cinematic music for the last 100 years, including John Williams and others. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Anything anybody wants to share about that? Yeah, sure.
You know, musically, this suite is, it was the precursor of so many other things that created imagery in music. Film scores, every film score, you know, that's been done probably is borrowed from this in some fashion.
Absolutely.
Of course, most of us know that the most important things Holst wrote were for military band, not organ. No, I'm kidding.
His very famous band suites.
Oh, yeah, so no, we love to claim him also on the wind end of things. But
he was a trombone player, just like you.
And, you know, and yet was incredibly gifted, so. For those of you that maybe haven't ever heard the entire suite put together, at least 6 of the 7 movements have been used in TV and movie. So even if you haven't heard the entire suite, you're going to recognize so much of this music from other aspects and other things.
Congratulations.
Yeah, just everything.
Yes.
So it's, you know, I think this, at least in my memory, this is the 3rd time that we've prepared a women's chorus. Jane did it the first time, and then I did it the last time this time. So, you know, this is a work that's worth doing and worth doing on occasion.
Yes.
So I'm thrilled that we're having a chance to do it again, and I love it. So,
yeah.
You know, that's.
The last time we did this was about 12 years ago, and we had a giant screen above the orchestra showing images of the planets, and we had a NASA expert giving information and narration. But I felt like those visuals took away from the performance. This time around, while we're playing the piece, Sarah's not going to be interrupting. There won't be anything else to see. There won't be, you know, drama happening. You get to focus on the orchestra. So I'm really pleased about that part of it.
Me too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could go through each of the movements, but we don't have time, really. But each one has some beautiful special qualities, beautiful instrumentation, unusual harmonies, meters, themes. You know, just to give you just a small sampling, the Venus comes next, and it has a very French kind of beautiful kind of quality to it. This is the bringer of peace. It's a wonderful way to calm down after Mars. But this is an absolutely gorgeous movement. What you might not realize, just listening to it, is that it has 14 tempo changes for me. The conductor's job is not easy in these.
You don't get the peace that
No, yeah, I am not at peace. I have to worry. All these subtle gradations of tempos. But he uses the harp and the celeste in beautiful ways. Listen to this. Glockenspiel as well. It has a beautiful quality to it. Next up is Mercury, the winged messenger. And in this one, it's fascinating because if you look at the musical score, some lines are in one key signature, some lines are in a completely different key signature, a tritone part. And so, again, he's playing with multiple key areas. This time not together, like they were clashing in Mars, but one after another to make it feel like you're not grounded and that you're flying through the air. And this is what that sounds like. So wonderful. Yeah. It has a playful trickster quality too. It's worth noting that there are some kind of connections between the movements.
Yes.
If you consider Jupiter as the center point of the fourth movement of these 7, if you go out, you can find connections between the ones. So like, in some ways, this is like the polar opposite of Saturn, which this comes right before Jupiter, Saturn comes right after it. Saturn is very slow, feels very grounded. This is very youthful and playful and fast. Yeah. It also is connected with Uranus as that trickster kind of feel to it. And then a solo violin. And other instruments. There's a lot of different solos passed off back and forth. And then Jupiter is the fourth movement. It has a number of fantastic tunes. Part of it was used very famously in that movie, The Right Stuff, about the aviators, pilots, and astronauts. The yum dum 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 dum. Many of you will recognize that. But for many of us, the middle section of Jupiter, which is the middle movement of the piece, the very centerpiece of the entire suite, is this gorgeous, beautiful, sort of like almost patriotic hymn type of thing, which later Holst did write words to, and it became a hymn, I Vow to Be My Country. And it's so special. That's worth going to. I'm going to play an example of that. So that's the way Jupiter starts. But the part I'm talking about is this part. Our program note annotator, Bill Rennan, said in his notes, Elgar must have just been beside himself when he first heard this. Why didn't I write that? He outdid Elgar.
He out-Elgar'd.
He out-Elgar'd Elgar. That's it, yeah. Brings out the best in you. It has that nobility, and it's just incredible. So we will do something sacrilegious and have intermission after Jupiter. It has a fantastic ending, too. It's just, you want to applaud there anyway. It is, because at the end of the entire suite, not to get ahead of ourselves, Neptune ends with the original fade out in music, like the first probably ever fade out in music. And it ends very, very quietly. And so this will be a great chance for you to actually applaud where you would want to applaud. But we are taking some liberties with the fact that it is a suite of 7 pieces.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about like the flow of that dramatically, and then what will happen in Act 2?
Well, I wonder if actually you want to play a little bit of Neptune, because I think there's something interesting in picking up on this idea about the relationship between the movements to each other. That when I was thinking through, okay, well, what is my path through all of these pieces together, particularly within the planets, through each movement, that there's a lot of really interesting writing about Holst's exploration of keys, and we were saying about the dissonance and things like that throughout, and this concept of that his that by the end, by the time he gets to Neptune, that it's this search for serenity, and that you can see that in how he's playing with the music itself and these different key changes, and I think there's relationships between particularly Mars and Neptune in an interesting fashion. And then so that, just as you're thinking through what the emotional path through all of this is, that part of it for me was that, well, what does it mean to have a search for serenity, and what is it that we are searching for when we're looking into the stars? But I think it's such the Neptune is so interesting relative to the others as well. I want to hear just a little bit of that. If you want to talk about that one as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, it definitely is related to Mars. They
Yeah.
both have that unusual meter of 5/4. It's almost as though he's bringing that back, but in a way that's more resolved.
Mm-hmm.
The subtitle here is Neptune the Mystic,
Mm-hmm.
and it's perhaps the most what you would think of sounding like outer space, floating in space. It's the most of all the movements that way. We're the farthest perhaps from Earth in this point. So this is a little bit of what Neptune sounds like. Sometimes he uses the alto flute, or as he calls it, bass flute, to, believe it or not, be the lowest voice of like everybody else playing. You can hear the tinkling in the harps. And there are all sorts of indications in the score that the entire movement must be played extremely quietly, with the exception of just a few little parts that he identifies that can come out of the texture. It all should be very, very quiet and not too, what we say, espressivo, not too expressive. Later, the women's chorus comes in, and they're in the score, it says that they're wordless, right? There's no text. They're just singing a syllable. And he says in the score they should be singing as in sun, the word sun. So it ties even that into the heavenly bodies. But when they come in, it's just magical. You're about to hear them come in. There they are.
It's a terrible vowel, you know that, right?
It is a terrible vowel to sing. Yeah. We've experimented with ah.
We're not using our Wyoming sun. We're using a little bit nicer placed sun. Yeah.
An English version.
An English, yes, a little bit of an English version.
Yeah, the chorus ends up singing this repeated pattern after this that will just fade into nothingness and go off into the distance. We skipped over Saturn and Uranus. I can play a little bits of them if you like.
Oh,
we have time.
We can play a bit at the beginning of Uranus.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So this is movement 6. This is the Magician.
Yes.
This has a sort of Sorcerer's Apprentice-like quality.
Yes.
For the students.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Scared, so yeah. And Saturn, we mentioned it before, the bringer of old age. Listen to this. It's like a clock ticking. and underneath this, the contrabasses, this bass section plays a melody that then rises through the orchestra.
I love the dual harps on this one.
Yeah.
It just,
This one's so fascinating. Apparently this was Holst's personal favorite movement. It ends with this beautiful vision of heaven. It's gorgeous. I'll just jump ahead to a little bit of that. Just amazing. So spacey too. Well, I know we're running out of time. We have a few other pieces to talk about. Once the planets is finished, we're going to go right into the Floyd, the aria that Sean was talking about, Ain't It a Pretty Night. Is there anything else about that, or how did you discover that and want to include it? Tell us about that.
So for this piece, I don't want to give too much away about the story where we're at that point in the evening, but there is no stargazing without a stargazer, and I think that the text of that aria, even removed from the opera itself, so we've taken out the parts that are specific to the story of the opera, sort of focused it on the parts about thinking, looking at the pretty night and dreaming about your life, which I think we all have done on occasion. And that really for me is where this came from as a piece that fits in with this evening overall is we'll have gone on this huge journey thinking where we start from with Mars, where we end by the time we get to Neptune, that we've gone through this emotional journey together. And then at this point in the night, we get back to what it means to be, specifically in this show, a woman is this full female chorus and me on stage, to be a woman standing and looking up at the stars and dreaming about what's more, what's out there, what could my life be, what is it now, how big can my thoughts get. I think one of the things that I think about a lot with space is, so Shakespeare, there's a principle about acting Shakespeare that the house, so the house when you're on stage, where the audience is called the house, that the house is your imaginative space. And that's something we all do, that where we think, we stare off into the distance, and the bigger the distance, the bigger the thoughts. And so having this piece about people standing and looking into the vastness of space and thinking, I really think it just evokes how big are those dreams that those women are having up on that stage.
Yeah. I love that. Some of the lyrics in this aria are just gorgeous. They're talking about looking at the stars and reflecting.
To go along with what you were saying, to me, especially the way we've set this, it leads to that. What's over that next hill? What is out there that I can dream about and potentially achieve? So, it's the idea of limitlessness, but still standing on this earthly plane that we're on. To go to your point about there has to be a stargazer. So, and we of course here in Wyoming are more fortunate than most people about our ability to look up at the night sky. Even here in Cheyenne, it's not as good as it was when I was a child, but I live up by Buford and I can see everything there. So that notion of I'm here, I'm grounded, I'm real, but what's out there? What's possible?
Right.
That's what this aria has brought to me.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's so true. And in the story of the opera, it's that young woman who's dreaming of leaving, her hometown, escaping and getting to the big city. She talks about Nashville and Asheville, all these places that she's only heard about. And that the stars are almost like reflecting all the fireflies above a pond, and it's just gorgeous. I'm a new huge fan of Carlisle Floyd. I don't know the rest of this opera well enough, and just in getting to know this aria, and thank you for suggesting I include it in this. It's brilliant and it's beautiful musically. It's so beautiful. Yeah. Then we'll end with some Debussy and his Clair de Lune, which is originally a piano piece in a transcription for orchestra. A very familiar, comforting kind of piece about moonlight. And tell us a little bit about why you chose that one.
And that one, this connects both back to this idea, and I love what you described this about being grounded on earth while looking up.
Right.
grounded in this reality while looking up. And I think that the piece at the end, I feel like evokes that as well, that there's something about, honestly, the familiarity of that piece. I think that the fact that it's something that most people will know and have heard, that there's an emotional grounding in that I think is also important at the end of the night. Again, we've gone on this huge journey, we've been launched into space and flown out past Neptune and come back to Earth to sit on the ground together and look at the moon, which also felt important with the eclipse coming up, so there was a little bit of the storytelling there as well. But yeah, I think it brings us back, and I cannot for the life of me remember who said this quote, but the idea that when you take a journey, that you travel away just to return home and know the place for the first time. And so it feels a little bit like that's also the ending of the evening, that we're back where we started and yet we are changed.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you refer to yourself in that character as the stargazer.
Yeah.
I think that's good for them to know, that what your role as sort of like narrator and host and dreamer and performer in this is the stargazer. But that's, you're trying to sort of speak for all of us, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that it's a little bit of what I was talking about at the beginning of our hour together just now. That so the character that I play is called the Stargazer, who is a little bit of me, a little bit of text from Eliot and Shakespeare and philosophers and storytellers, and a little bit of all of us, I think, about what is it to be that person, that young woman. So there's stories from my childhood in there about to be that person standing on Earth, gazing at the stars and dreaming, thinking, and. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We have some time for a few minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions.
So this is a wonderful presentation and all. And this isn't really a question, but I noticed in the program that it said that Dr. Harlan Rudnick was a sponsor, and Harlan just recently passed away. And I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Dr. Rudnick was a great friend of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. He loved our performances. This concert, he approached the symphony staff at near the end of summer, I think it was, or sometime in the fall, and asked if he could sponsor a concert again, and chose this concert back then, many months ago. And it came as a terrible, tragic shock to lose him last week. And it's so interesting that with this idea of Harlan himself was an aviator and liked to travel up into the skies. And we're doing this piece kind of about staring up and flying high. And I love to imagine him flying higher than he's ever been with some of this music and where he is now. But it's a terrible loss. He and his company, Paint Consultants of the Rockies, had sponsored for many years. Not every year, but many, many times over the years. And he particularly loved music by Stravinsky. He particularly asked for it. In fact, when we did The Rite of Spring, it was in a way through his encouragement. And so there are a number of stories over the years. When we did Raiders of the Lost Ark, with the film live at the orchestra, I'll never forget, he gave me this fantastic bullwhip straight from Australia. The two of us were behind the Paramount in that large parking lot back there, whipping this bullwhip together for a good hour. It was a great time. He will be missed. Sir?
So how about you can dedicate the concert tomorrow to Dr. Harlan Rudnick?
It's a great idea. We'll definitely consider that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Well, I want to thank our two wonderful guests, Sarah Hartmann and Sean Ambrose, and I want to thank you all for being here. And again, thanks to the Laramie County Library. This has been a wonderful partnership for many, many years. I believe Kelly is going to announce a few upcoming events.